Welcome everyone to our Memoir versus Fiction panel with Saints and Sinners 2021. I'm Jim Provenzano. I'm a 7-time author and an editor with the Bay Area Reporter. And joining us will be multiple published authors, Lucy Jane Bledsoe, Perry Brass, Farzana Doctor, and Gar McVey-Russell. We're talking to you I'm in San Francisco. Gar is in the East Bay in California, and I think Farzana is in Toronto, Perry is in New York, and Lucy Jane is somewhere in Antarctica? No, where are you, Lucy?
I'm on the Oregon coast right now.
Oh, somewhere scenic, I knew, yes. So what we're talking about today is I want to help people answer the question that usually pops up at any literary reading you all may know. What part of your book is real and what part of it is made up? That's the kind of perfunctory version of it. But what I really want to get into is how do we sculpt actual experiences into fiction, and why do we decide sometimes to turn it into memoir? I haven't read everyone's works, but I've read passages or some books, and I know that everyone does both, as well as essays. So I wanted to start off with Lucy Jane Bledsoe, who has traveled the world. You have done nonfiction and fiction, but we know that you have been to places like the aforementioned Antarctica. So tell me how you decided to turn some of your major works into fiction versus doing environmental essays versus doing memoir, which you have a memoir coming up, is that right?
No, well, yes and no. Well, that's a perfect question for this panel. Yeah, I mean, I love this panel actually because I think about it so much. I feel like the evolution of my work is going from writing from my imagination. Increasingly, I'm writing from real life. Perhaps I have enough real life to write about now. So this is coming up for me more and more, but it also came up earlier in my work when I'd say the number one question I am always asked at readings is, oh, what did this really happen? And it would irritate me so much because I was writing pure fiction. Of course there's bits from my life, but no, it didn't happen. I had one friend say to me about a story of mine, I know who Susan is. No, it's like, no, she's a fictional character. You don't know who she is. But I am writing more and more from my real life. And this became a really huge question. What's the difference between memoir and fiction? When I wrote my novel, A Thin Bright Line, which was published in 2016, it's the story of my aunt for whom I'm named. Her name is also Lucy Bledsoe. She died in this tragic fire very young, and I always suspected, and I won't go through why I suspected, that she was a lesbian. And when I asked my mom, I was shocked because my mom sort of almost admitted it. Which normally for her, nobody would be queer. She goes, well, she probably was, but I am sure, positive, she never ever acted on it. And that just drove me bonkers. Like, how would my mom know that this woman never acted on it? So it set me on this path of finding out who my aunt and namesake was. I did enormous amounts of research, and a lot of the book, A Thin Bright Line, is about that research and what I could know and what I couldn't know. In the end, I chose to fictionalize the story because I discovered she did have lovers, she did have an intimate life, and what is so upsetting is when that intimacy of our lives is stripped from us like my mother did. She never acted on it. So I wanted to write sex scenes. I wanted to write dialogue. I wanted to show that she did have an intimate life based on the evidence I found. But of course, if you're writing memoir, you can't actually write fully truthful sex scenes or even dialogue because you don't know exactly what happened. So that's A Thin Bright Line.
Wow. Yeah, that's a question that I want to ask Perry next, is the idea of creating intimacy with fictional characters that are based on perhaps real people. Perry, your memoirs and your essays go back to the Gay Activists Alliance, and I remember one of your works focuses on your childhood or a character's childhood in the South.
Yes.
When do you decide to say, this is visceral, it really happened, but is it how you described it? Is that where it becomes fiction?
No. Actually, thank you for bringing that up, Jim. I don't make a big distinction between what we would call memoir, that is something that actually happened, and fiction, something that we create, because, well, to begin with, all of my writing really stems from that period. I was not in Gay Activist Alliance, although I had many friends who were, but I was a member of the Gay Liberation Front.
Sorry.
That's okay. They're both wonderful, primal organizations as far as the gay movement is concerned. And I spent 3 years of my life in GLF, starting when I was 22 years old. And it was probably the most formative 3 years of my life. And one of the main feelings, attitudes, ideas in GLF was that morality came from authenticity, that what was right came from what was authentic. And this was the complete opposite of what had gone on before the gay liberation movement happened, because at that point, morality was going to come from a cookie cutter view of what was right, what was wrong, and not from actual authenticity. Whereas in GLF, we believed that being gay was authentic, being a woman was authentic, being Black or minority was authentic. These were the authentic parts of our life, and everything that we did was to bring these out and work from these authentic parts of our lives. So my writing, and actually my art itself, because I started out as a painter, came from this idea of what is the authentic thing that's inside me that makes me Perry Brass, that made me leave the South when I was 17 years old and hitchhike from Savannah, Georgia to San Francisco, and had this, at the age of 17, this basically out gay life. Everything that has come from that has come from what are the real feelings that I'm going to put into my work. If the real feelings are not there, I can't do it. There's a certain amount of fiction, of commercial fiction, in which real feelings are kind of like a byproduct if they're allowed at all. But I think that in good fiction, in great fiction, it has to come from the most genuine, real feelings. In fact, I tell people I don't really write in words. I write in feelings and images, and I translate them into words. If you're really working with yourself, all these parts of yourself, this history of yourself, the words come. There's a wonderful quote from, of all people, Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, when he says, he's talking about the festival in Pamplona, and he says, on Saturday, the festa exploded. That's the only way I can put it. That's the word. It exploded. So in my work, there are explosions of feelings. There are feelings that cannot be hemmed in any longer, that have to come out. And I think that's so much of what, to me, being queer is about. Is like, how do we get these feelings out? The feelings that are still contained, that are still rarely really recognized. So I did write this book that was about a young boy in the South, and it is fiction. It's not based on my real life. I did not grow up in a well-heeled suburb of Savannah called Isle of Hope. I grew up in a public housing project in Savannah after my father died when I was 11, leaving us absolutely penniless. I did not go to a Catholic military school like the main character did, but all of my feelings are in this boy. And I did know a particular boy whom I sort of modeled his character on, and whom I really adored when I was a kid. But strangely enough, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was that my father died when I was 11 years old, and I was not allowed to say goodbye to him. And one of the most pivotal moments in the book is when Benji's father, Robbie, is dying of cancer in a veterans hospital in Augusta, Georgia, and he gets to say goodbye to Robbie. And that's what I wanted to do so much. And I remember writing that scene, I was crying at my computer. I mean, the feelings were just coming out of me so much. So it is fiction, but it's very much a memoir aspect of what fiction should be, what good fiction has got to be.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned an emotional truth. Even if you change the setting and geography,
Yes,
there's an emotional truth that has to be, or that compels us to write.
yes. Well, that's what I learned in the Gay Liberation Front, was that there is an emotional truth that has to be recognized. And what we wanted was for it to be recognized by every aspect of society, by the law, by psychiatry, by religion, by medicine. That's what we wanted. But as a writer, what I want is to have my emotional truth connect with the reader's emotional truth. And they will.
Right. So, Farzana, you deal with sex and relationships in your column, and also with women's rights issues with female genital mutilation in your work. And you're also a psychotherapist, and you have five novels, four novels. Can you talk about, Farzana, can you talk about when you get an idea for writing, okay, this is going to go to my practice, this is going to go to an essay, oh no, this is a story. Can you talk about which of your books, how you decided to make them more fictional or more any autobiographical moments?
Definitely, yeah. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. And this has been so interesting so far. And I'm really resonating with what Lucy, Jane, and Perry have said so far. In my early books, my first three novels, I really resisted the idea of writing from a personal place. But of course, the personal bits got in there. And I would also have those that irritation with, those questions that assumed that my protagonist was me. But with my fourth novel, Seven, here it is, this novel is pretty heavily influenced by personal experiences as well as an ancestor's experience. So at the time that I was just beginning to form this novel, I was very, and I still am, involved in a group called We Speak Out, which is a group of women from my Dawoodi Bohra community that are fighting against a form of female genital cutting that happens in our community. And at the same time, I was dealing with my own personal trauma around this issue. And then fully formed fictional scenes were just kind of flowing out of me, which is like the most amazing way to have writing happen, right? It sort of happens despite you. And so, as I was writing, I knew I was writing a fictional story, but a lot of my own emotional truths were in there for sure. The other piece is that the character in the novel is doing some research about her great-great-grandfather. And prior to writing this novel, I was doing some research about my own great-great-grandfather, and I couldn't get a ton of information about him. I got like the frame of his story. I knew where he was born, when he, moved to this city. I knew about his business holdings. We have his will. We have a number of those kinds of records. But I was most interested in his relationships. Over time, he had 4 wives. One died after the next. He divorced another, and then so he ended up having 4 in his life. And I was very curious about what caused divorce of number 3, and what was it like to have 2 wives die in childbirth. And so I had to create fictional scenes around, these relationships and his motivations. And then I also wanted to look at the impact of inheritance. What are the legacies that people leave us, and who are we as a result of them? So I was also looking at how his story would intersect with my protagonist, who is this woman who goes to India on this marriage-saving trip, and she thinks she's going to be spending all her time doing this research and homeschooling her kid, and she ends up being quite embroiled in the politics of FGM in her community. So her story and his story end up intersecting.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I have a background in AIDS activism that would not stay out of my second and third novels because I ended up completely fictionalizing actions. But now that it's become kind of almost queer folklore, with Sarah Schulman's new book coming out about the history of ACT UP, it's amazing how she tells the tale but because it's multiple interviews, it becomes a sort of fiction because it's everyone's singular interpretation of what a Wall Street demo or whatever was about. That's what I find fascinating, is that we have these, like as Perry mentioned, we have, if you've participated in momentous parts of the queer culture or even your family life, that's where you're given the burden of documenting this, even if it is a bit, even if you have to fictionalize it to tell a good story. That's what I find fascinating. Gar, you have in Sin Against the Race, there's a jazz history, there's an escape to Germany, there's a guy named Alfonso who becomes part of an activist organization at UCLA, is that right? Can you talk about how historical moments or things that you discovered in your life led to your novel?
Oh boy, yeah, it's almost a culmination of the first 30 odd years and 25 odd years of Gar's history. I took bits and pieces of my life, and I guess I was sitting here thinking and listening to everybody's talking, and one of the influence for me in writing was probably Maya Angelou and her series of books, starting with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and sort of telling her story the way that she told it, and possibly to a lesser extent, Zumi, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde. So yeah, here's the book, by the way, Sin Against the Race. Yay. It's about connecting with yourself and connecting with that part of you that you know exists and that everyone else around you ignores or thinks does not exist. It doesn't exist in the family. Queerness doesn't exist in your family. It doesn't exist in society. It's those people over there, and sort of you're fighting your own psyche in a way to say, no, I do exist, and you're trying to beat against that. So it wasn't that I grew up in a particularly homophobic family like my character Alfonso. Alfonso is the son of a politician. He's the son of a city councilman and the grandson of the first Black state assemblyman in their home state, which is actually unidentified. It's probably Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania, but I don't say that. So he has that kind of pressure on him to conform to the family standard of being a politician. I didn't grow up with that, but it's sort of a representation of the pressure I kind of just felt to not be gay. So that is kind of what comes out in the book. And then, so when Alfonso does finally start forming relationships, it's sort of in the back corners. I have him meet the person who would eventually become his boyfriend, Jamil, in a restroom. And that's very much part of my coming out, was cruising restrooms when I was a student at UCLA. Quite possibly the subject of a future work. That came out in the story. Act Up, like you were saying, Jim, is an absolute influence of what came out in the story. I came out through Act Up. The March on Washington in '87, I knew a lot of friends who went to that. I was just starting to realize, okay, maybe that's why I stare at that guy in the Lycra bike shorts. I was just starting to come out myself, and knowing this march happened, and as you probably know in history, ACT UP LA is a direct result of that march, because guys came back from that, men and women came back from that, and basically started ACT UP LA, because ACT UP New York's first actions that's when they made the national splash. So I knew people who were involved with that. I started going to ACT UP LA meetings in Plummer Park in West Hollywood. And the neat thing about ACT UP LA was that there were a lot of older gays and lesbians and bisexuals or transgenders who had been involved in earlier struggles. So I got kind of that sense of history. Some of the stuff that Perry was talking about, because some of them were in gay liberation fronts and things like that. So all that history kind of came into the work of the book, and plus which I was a history major at UCLA, so I like history. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I find all these things, it's taking elements that are truths, as everyone has been saying, and making them into an interesting story, because I don't necessarily think that my life is worthy of coming out as a memoir per se. Perhaps parts of them are. Perhaps I need to grow up a bit more, like Lucy was saying, and to realize that maybe I do have a story there. But it's sort of telling the truth of being queer, growing up queer, and using yourself as an example to influence these characters. That's kind of what happened in Sin Against the Race a lot.
Okay. Yeah, that we have a lot of, I have some old ACT UP LA photos when I visited in 1990 when they took over City Hall. I'll have to share with you. You might even be in one or two of them. I love doing research, whether it's completely made up work, like my 5th novel, which is mostly set in Philadelphia, as you mentioned, Gar. I didn't know Philadelphia, so I went there ahead of a visit to New York and took pictures and went to archives, and it was amazing. And it had, most of it I didn't even use. I just referenced this or that. I want to go back to Lucy and say, you know, the nature work, the rafting trip, which is a suspenseful thriller, which should be adapted to a film immediately. Not that literature needs to be adapted, but it was quite exciting. And I think I asked you the same silly question. Did that really happen? Because I felt very fanboy about it. Let's talk about, can everyone just like find a moment from one of their works where they had to do some research, whether it was based on their own lives or something that didn't happen, like Farzana, you're talking about family history, looking up documents. I love the research. Can we just find a reference to where you made a discovery or you couldn't find out the truth behind something, so you had to make it fiction?
The story, can I interject?
Or,
yeah. So the story I wrote that's in last year's Saints and Sinners fiction anthology, thank you. It's called Tom of Bolt Hall. I am a longtime employee of UC Berkeley School of Law, and which was formerly known as Bolt Hall. That name was dropped because Bolt was a nasty racist person. However, it's a very old school, and it has a very fascinating history. If you've been to the UC Berkeley campus at all, you know that the law school is sort of on the southeast corner. It was originally in a very, very, very small building in the center of campus. And first off, it was built, which was built in 1911. And it had this history of being, of course, very male dominated, because this is, you know, early 20th century. The basement of Bolt Hall, the original Bolt Hall, was a men's only space. The very few women students that were there could not go down there. All the student groups were down in the basement. The women had a little cloakroom, which was sort of a closet off the library on the 2nd floor. So in this men's only space, there was a restroom, there was a locker room, and in the restroom, there was a tiny little shower stall. And I was thinking, wow, imagine all the cruising that would have happened down there. So that basically is the story of Tom of Bolt Hall. It's about this young African-American, which were very rare. And this was set in 1935. So I had to do research of what was the class size at Bolt Hall at those days. Where did the classes meet? Because the building was so small, how could they all fit in there? When did the restrooms become, when did the basement become unisex, finally? So that it was really fascinating delving into the history of this place where I've been working for 30 odd years.
Yeah, there's a little detail like that can lead to blossom out into an entire thing. Lucy, can you discuss a little bit about your opportunities in traveling? Specifically, I'm just fascinated by your fascination with the environment, Antarctica, and nature, but the question earlier of research, how research leads to something that you decide to either fictionalize or turn into an essay or nonfiction.
Yeah, I mean, since you mentioned Lava Falls, that's probably the most recent piece of writing that I've had published, and it's a novella that anchors my short story collection that came out last year. The collection is called Lava Falls, and this sort of happened in the reverse of how it usually happens for me. The publisher was doing this collection of short fiction. I was thrilled because it's hard to get collections published, and my editor said, "But we need something to anchor the collection. We want you to write something new." Maybe a novella, and novellas are my very favorite form. I love that length, like a 100-page story. I love it. Short stories never enough. A novel's, So I was like, oh God, I love this idea, but I don't write on demand very easily. I don't just just come up with something in the next 6 months. So my editor goes, well, you're going on that Grand Canyon trip down the Grand Canyon on the raft. You write about that. And again, it's like, no, I write about things that happened. It takes me years to process all this. So I said, no, can't do that. But I'm not going to say no to a publisher. Yeah, I'll get you a novella. And I know how to do it. But I went on this Grand Canyon trip with 12 women. It was a 3-week trip. It was absolutely spectacular. Sometimes when things are billed as spectacular, like a Grand Canyon trip, you're a little let down, but it was everything I thought it would be. But what I didn't know was all of the political stuff I learned about the Grand Canyon. The former president and his other folks have been trying to open up all that public land to uranium mining, and they are succeeding. And who's fighting it are the indigenous tribes that border the Grand Canyon, and a couple environmental groups. But it's this huge fight, and we are losing. And they're literally trying to open up the Grand Canyon, this national landmark and treasure, to uranium mining. So I learned all about that. I also learned that this massive sexual harassment case has been exploding the National Park Service. And I was a National Park Service ranger at Mont Rainier when I was much younger. So this kind of broke my heart because I love the National Park Service. And the center of it all was at the Grand Canyon, where there were one particular ranger, but also 2 or 3 who were working the canyon corridor and literally demanding sex in exchange for survival things like food and stuff of the women guides down there. It was just, the details of the cases that opened, it was like, it's not unbelievable, of course, but me being the innocent heart I am, I keep finding it unbelievable. So these people were fired, the superintendent was fired, and the Grand Canyon River corridor, maybe arguably the biggest tourist site in all of the United States, went unpatrolled for 2 whole years. There's no one down there. It was just this free-for-all. So learning about these 2 huge political events, and most of my work is based on environmental and gender justice issues, I couldn't not write my novella about the Grand Canyon, as my editor suggested. So I took a group of women. Again, I did use some characters and some scenes from my trip, but I fictionalized and I sent them on a trip down the Grand Canyon. But I sent them down the Grand Canyon in a moment that's just in the very near future where the Park Service has collapsed. In fact, this was true that the Grand Canyon was not patrolled for 2 summers, but in my story, that's all just fallen apart completely. It's a little bit of a mystery, but there's a uranium mining lobbyist who is also in the canyon at that time. And so I developed this whole story based on all that. And yeah, it's sort of the first time I was able to come up. I'm glad you like the story, Jim, because I've been nervous about it because I wrote it faster than I usually write things. And but so that's how that Lava Falls happened.
Yeah, it's a thrill ride, but it has those layers that now I see how you inserted, without being overstating it, the research, actual history versus a near future tone that gives it a future. It just had so many elements to it. I like cranking out a short story that I know is not going to become. Sorry, the sun just came out and I probably look like a ghost.
You're shiny.
Yeah, I'm a little shiny. I like a story that doesn't throw too much. How do I put it? not propaganda, but issue-oriented work. And the way all of you have been able to finesse issue-oriented work in memoir and fiction. Perry, can you talk a little bit about that? How you can pull away from the activist you, that we all have issues that we've probably, protested, et cetera. How do you pull away to make the literature better than being just an infomercial for the cause?
That's never really occurred to me. I know that's kind of strange. Part of it is the fact that I also work as a journalist a lot. So I do a lot of journalism. And so I can, skew that into journalism a little bit more overtly than I can in fiction. I was going to say there's like a constant creative writing course dictum that young writers always hear, which is write what you know. And I always believe you can't just write what you know. You have to write what you want to know and what you need to know. And if you only wrote what you know, then half of Shakespeare wouldn't have been written. I mean, what would he have known about being a 14-year-old girl? But he created Juliet. So with my own fiction, often I kind of like going off on a ledge. I like going off into a place that is really difficult and dangerous for me. And I don't like fiction that doesn't do that doesn't have those stakes involved. When I did this book, The Substance of God, it's hitting about 15 years ago, I decided that part of it had to take place in Turkey. I'd never been to Turkey. I had friends who went to Turkey, spent time in Turkey. So I called my friends. I said, let's talk about Turkey. Tell me everything that you can about your time in Turkey. I did lots and lots of research about Turkey. I didn't feel any problems about the fact that I'd never been to Turkey, because Turkey was going to be in the background. It was going to pop up at various points. And I understood, having been in other countries that kind of share that Mediterranean sort of culture, having been in those countries, I could write about some of the mores there, certainly could write about that. And there was a kind of richness that came from this, the fact that I was pushing myself out into this place that was not very comfortable, and then getting into a story that at moments really kind of scared the shit out of me. It was like, I wanted that to happen. I wanted those things to happen. And the weird thing is this book is now having a renaissance. Like, suddenly I'm getting all kinds of orders for this book from Amazon. And Amazon has decided, this is really amazing, has decided that they can sell this book as Christian literature. So we have a very queer book with lots of queer sex in it, that although one of the main characters in the book is a Christian businessman who's also a kind of devout closet case, and he's married, but he has a real sexual thing for other men. So they've been selling the book as Christian literature, and okay, fine, if you want to do that, that's great with me. But just the idea that you go off into this, like I say, this ledge that's uncomfortable for you, where you're not even sure how far you can go with it. I think that's wonderful for a writer. Sure. Writers who don't do that, and you can really see writing that doesn't do that, that does not appeal to me.
No, there's a safety mechanism of, I experienced this and therefore I have the authority to write about it. In my 7th novel, which is categorized, it's about a gay filmmaker in the 90s in Los Angeles, yes, who then also reflects on growing up in the Midwest and summer theater and having a crush on the older Tulsa version of himself in the production of Gypsy. Now, I actually did that second part, but I was Yonkers, and finding Yonkers is really never sounded like had a good ring to it. So that's the fiction I made. I made it Tulsa because, of course, Tulsa is the object of affection as opposed to, and I never made a feature film, but I visited Los Angeles a lot, and I know filmmakers, and I've made short films. So that's the kind of risk I took. But the risk that you mentioned, Perry, for me was going into my past and fictionalizing it while still being truthful and not making it too pretty, not making it too palatable, but also making it difficult. Farzana, I want to switch to you and ask how.
Well, can I just say one thing? I just want to, that book that you did, that novel about the guys in the Midwest. The other one. I thought that
Now I'm here.
was really a ledge. I mean, I could really feel that sense of danger through that book. I really
Thank you. I just watched It's a Sin, the BBC show that was really touching and wonderful, but it took that risk that I think has been erased from gay male literature, is that allowing people to die.
Yes.
We had this whole renaissance of nobody dies anymore because we need to survive and we need to be heroes. Right. But I'm sorry, 200,000 people, I had 200 friends die that I know of. So I had main characters, sorry, spoiler alert, who die of AIDS.
Yes.
And nobody said, oh, I'm so upset with that. But that's where I think, I mean, it's frightening to go there to say, yeah, there's no sequel, but everyone.
It just ripped my heart out. I thought it was a wonderful book. And you really, there are all kinds of things in that book that were just not pat and comfortable. There really were.
Well, it was a life that is not mine. And although I did work on a pumpkin farm and I did play Bohemian Rhapsody for my senior piano recital, those two separate things somehow became two people and one novel. But I had been sitting on that book for 25 years.
Really?
25 years of going into it, doing 1,000 words, getting very afraid of it because I knew from the beginning it was about two main characters who are going to die of AIDS. And when you only have 2,000 words and you still have to develop the life of a character, it's horrifying. This is why I don't write murder mysteries or thrillers or science fiction or horror. You have to kill people. I don't want to have that hang around in my head for 20 years.
Oh, I love it. No, I love killing them. I love it. I love it.
Anyway, enough about me. Let me give Farzana the mic. And can you talk about which of your works maybe has more family researched, as you mentioned, and which is, I really made this up. I really was creative about, what happens.
Yeah, I would say that all of the first three novels had just a lot of creative, let's see what happens. But with this last novel, I was doing a lot of research in various kinds of ways. So one story is that I ended up doing a trip to Dolka, which is my ancestral village, my family's ancestral village, and the place where the ancestor character originates from. And I was hoping to go there to learn more about him. And in the end, I didn't find, again, it's so hard to do historical research about real people. So I ended up finding out, I guess, more about myself, which was kind of a fun thing. As a diasporic person, we came to Canada when I was a baby. There's often this weird sense of like, what is home? And being in that ancestral village, which, is kind of a small place. I was in like the 3 blocks where he would have come from. And, I got to see like my great grandmother's old house and stuff like that. I really started to get a sense of like, this is the patch of earth where my people are from. And I'd never had that before. So that's probably going to enter into a future novel because that's just too fresh, that kind of like, wow, kind of moment. But in terms of what I couldn't find out, and then I turn into fiction. So I never really learned why this ancestor divorced his third wife. It would have been a very odd thing for somebody from a very conservative culture. This is a very insular kind of Orthodox religion as well. It'd be very strange to have a divorce in, the year 1900. So I got to make up stuff, which is so much fun, right? So I created a bit of a scandal. I won't get into it because it's, it's a spoiler, but I got to create a scandal that was actually a bit aspirational. That's the other thing I love about fiction, is we get to kind of point the way. We can show the problems and, you know, the social justice issues, but we can also point the way towards resistance. And so I got to write how this third wife was doing some pretty subversive things around gender-based violence. And that was one of my favorite things. The other piece is I ended up writing an epilogue that is 10 years into the future. And, you know, there's no way to know what's going to happen in 10 years with this issue or the community. But, you know, I got to decide. I got to create that. And that was really fun too. So, you know, I think one of the reasons why I write from my own personal experience in the advice column that I write, and in some of the essays that I've written. But I didn't want to make this a memoir because I think the issues were just too fresh for me. You know, I was talking about stuff that happened 6 years ago, and it came into my awareness 6 years ago. Of course, the original trauma, you know, happened 40 odd years ago, but it was just too new in my processing of it. So maybe there will be a memoir in 20 years because I need to sit on things a long time too.
Well, this is an important issue is the issue of time, obviously, because memoir, the prerequisite is this happened a long time ago, and that's why it's fascinating, and I'm telling it to you. I don't feel bad that my 7th novel took 25 years to write, because the filmmaking stuff is in the mid-1990s, and I was writing it as it was going on. You know, with the Rodney King riots and my visits to Los Angeles, I would go and take notes. So I'm fine with it having sat over there while I went and wrote these other books. But you mentioned time. So when do you know when it's right? Because some of these stories we're writing took decades to foment in our brains.
Yes. Yes.
Farzana, can you start on that?
How do you know when it's right? You know, I don't think I know the answer to that. My second novel, 6 Meters of Pavement, you know, is about this character who 20 years in the past forgot his baby daughter in the backseat of a car and she died. So I was writing about a hot car death, right? And I couldn't figure out why I was writing such a terrible premise, you know, like how to make a book unsellable. You write this really bad premise, right? In the end, it did well. But I didn't know why I was writing that book. You know, I had read an article about a hot car death before that, and it just stuck with me. And
Talk
then,
about going out on a ledge.
Yes, and
That's
then
a real ledge.
I ended up, you know, going to, my dad lives in Texas now, and I was visiting him, and he had read like half the book at this point. I was doing some touring, and I asked him, "So what do you think of it, Dad?" And he said, "Did your mother ever tell you that story about when you were a baby?" And then he proceeded to tell me this story about how they had left me in the backseat of the car, and I didn't die, obviously, but you know, they had to revive me, you know. And as he was telling me the story, like all of the hairs on the back of my neck were like standing up, and I was sweating. You know, it was a really air-conditioned house, so cold, but I was just sweating. And I realized, oh, there's something that was in my cellular memory from that time that just needed to speak. So, you know, that was 40 years later.
Wow.
Thrilling story. I totally believe it was in your cellular memory, you know? Yeah.
So that needed a long time before I could write it, obviously. But I don't know. I don't think that there's any prescription for how long.
It's an extremely gripping subject, though. I mean, you can't. I mean, there was a horrible death like that happened in the New York area where this man lost 2 of his kids. They, you know, and the whole city was just gripped by this. And I mean, I wrote a poem about it. I didn't know who I felt worse for. Felt for him or for the kids or for his whole family. So it, you know, it's an incredibly gripping story. I was going to say about when do you know when it's time to do these things? I think it's when you can't escape them anymore. Like I just published a memoir about 2 years ago, and people have been saying to me, "You need to publish this book. You need to write this." And I was very scared of doing it. And then finally, I couldn't begin it, and I kept doing false beginnings and false beginnings. And then finally, one day I was exercising and the first sentence of the book came to me, and then the first paragraph, and then we're off and running. So it's like these things, they do have their time, and then you can't escape them.
Right. Yeah, Gar, do you have deadlines in your head about what the memories, how they grow until they have to be written about?
Yes, and I mean, nothing that has been written yet, but the Me Too movement has forced an issue from my past that I have to reconcile with. And it's been over 40 years and I have to deal with it. Yes.
You don't want to extrapolate, or you've answered the question, so okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, timing is everything. It took me 25 years to write Sin Against the Race. I had to kind of figure out what was the exact story I wanted to tell there. And I had to give myself permission to write that story. It basically was one of the reasons why it took as long as it did to write it. I had to give myself permission to say it's okay to criticize the Black community for being homophobic sometimes. It doesn't mean that they're evil people. It means that sometimes people are homophobic.
Yeah.
I need to find the space to write about my sexual past, so that I feel that I can impart the story in a way that's comfortable for me, and that tells the story in the most honest way possible. And that's about all I can say about it at the moment.
No, that's a good point, because I'm kind of running out of novels, and one of the things every morning or before bed, I think of a passage from what I hope will be my memoir I've ever written about my dance and theater years, because I started writing during those years, but by hand. So I have to transcribe like 500 pages worth of journal writing just to show how juvenile my writing was then. But the point is, I think I have one, is we have these sections of our lives in time. And for me, it's, it was AIDS, before, during, or after AIDS. If you're going to do a novel and it's gay, you have to decide, like those oak trees that are cut in half, or the Cenozoic slivers of history in paleontology. How are we going to write about now in, say, 5 or 10 years? I'd like to just go, everyone to kind of consider, tell us, what are you writing now that isn't just a journal entry about, oh my God, I'm hoarding toilet paper, but how are we going to confront now as a pivotal moment in history that, for our fiction, memoir, whatever, we really can't avoid in writing about, or can we in fiction? I wrote a fictional piece, a wacky short story that I just threw out to the universe because it was a bunch of things going on right now. The animals invading private homes, all kinds of contemporary things. And I tried to make it humorous. Are we allowed to do humor about a pandemic? I'm throwing questions out, and I'm going to throw it to Lucy. What is the timeline now for writing about now, then? What are you going to do?
That's a really good question. I first and maybe it's part of the answer to that question, but I just want to respond to what Gar said about the strong emotional impetus to write a story. Because sometimes it is just an opportunity, please write a novella, and something comes up. But the novel I'm working on right now is coming from this extreme, I'm sorry, I just have to say it, rage I've been feeling for a few years, that I hate living with this rage. I know a lot of us are living with it. And taking that emotional, I just have to do something with it. And it's really, really, really helping to take that and write a novel about it. Part of my rage is at the white Christian right. And so in writing this novel about these evil right-wing Christian people, I have to use air quotes. I've also had to develop a character who is a Christian pastor who is actually Christian and progressive. And in developing this character, which is the hardest part in a way, sort of bringing me around in my rage. So for me, that probably applies to writing about the pandemic too in these years, although right now I'm talking about writing basically about the 4 years of these political 4 years and my rage around that. Just taking that emotional impetus and trying to figure out how to make a story out of it. And for me, it's, the rage is not enough. I have to find the love somewhere and the connection, and that's the hard part. But it's also why I love writing so much, because I take these bits from my life and make it into a story eventually. But for me, usually that does take a few years. I kind of like, after 9/11, there's a few 9/11 novels came out, and I've never done a 9/11 novel, but I was interested.
You did an earthquake novel, though. You did that earthquake
novel, yes. But
amazing. Tell us the title. Remind me.
Yeah, well, that's a good example. I was just saying the title of my earthquake novel is The Evolution of Love. And it's, again, about how you take this trauma and these evil people and what they're doing. But this idea I have, because I read and write a lot of science, that the human race is eventually evolving towards people who have compassion and can work cooperatively together, and that is actually the evolution of who we are. And we can't see it right now because evolution is a very, very, very long, slow process. But the people who are more interested in conflict and dividing us are going to die out, because that is not a trait that's going to keep us going. So now I'm getting, I'll stop.
That sums up the book very nicely. Gar, did you want to say something too about
I love Evolution of Love and the message behind it, and just that message that it's the love that's going to evolve and save us, and not all these aggressive traits. I mean, just real quickly, for me about this time, it's all tied up with the one we just got rid of, and and all the hate that he brought on. And it's basically like it's the culmination of the country's greatest sin, which is its racism.
Yes.
And it's coming to a head. It's coming after us and killing us, literally, with this hideous virus. And yet we still are unable to sort of take collective a step back and say, wait, let's see what's really going on here. Why are we acting the way we are?
I think that I describe this period as we're now in the especially in New York, in the masquerade party. Everyone's wearing a mask. Everyone is wearing a mask, and we've been through a 4-year masquerade party with Donald Trump. And you really feel that here in New York. Really feel it.
Farzana, you have the advantage of living in Toronto, so you can look down on us, or do you feel overwhelmingly affected by the ineptitude of American response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
We have our own version of the one you just got rid of all over this country too. We have the Proud Boys originated here, so we're not in that much better of a situation. And the anti-Black violence and anti-Indigenous violence is really terrible here too. So I think on the surface, people sort of see us as being a bit better off, but I think, we're affected by some of the same things. And I was just going to say about the pandemic, I'm not sure how all of this is going to enter into my writing. I have written a couple of poems about, just my own feelings and what I've been experiencing as I've been experiencing, like everyone else, all of these changes and the uncertainties. I'm also, a psychotherapist in the afternoon. In the morning, I'm a writer. In the afternoon, I'm a psychotherapist. And so, this has been quite a year for my clients. And there's this thing called parallel processing that is happening for all of the therapists out there, right? Where we're listening to our clients talk about all of their fears and anxieties about the very same things that we're having fears and anxieties about, right? And holding space for that when you're also holding all of the same fears. So I have a feeling that this is going to find a way into my work, but I don't know exactly when. The thing that I'm working on right now, and I'm like, it's the baby stages. Like, I think I have 10 pages written at this point, which is like for me, a terrifying stage of the writing, because I don't know if I even have anything. I have been thinking a lot about, I'm part of this College of Social Workers. They're the people who are like the body that govern us in our work. And I'm really, really livid with them these days for lots of reasons. And I think that I'm going to need to write a novel about that. And hopefully the anger will transform into lots of nuanced things. It usually does. But I think the anger is propelling me at least to write these first 10 pages. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's a scary place. I love that place to be with. I tend to try to journal my dreams, which are now becoming much more pandemic themed, because I watched all those post-apocalyptic movies as a kid, and Mad Max is my, it happens. But I was thrilled that what I thought was a short story turned into my fourth novel, because I could not stop writing. And it was very escapist. I'm wondering how much of our personal lives outside of, or in spite of the pandemic, will be enjoyed later on, because we chose to write at a different time. And this is where memoir comes in. We have the advantage of going back, back in time, forward in time. We can reference Perry's science fiction book, but that's what I'm wondering about, the efficacy of escapism. That if we have a life that we write about in the 70s or the 80s, is that truth, but it's also kind of escapism because people don't have to think about this right now.
Yes. I think
Yeah.
very much. Yes. Yes. And I'm trying to deal with the idea of doing volume 2 of my memoir, which will be about my life in New York in the 70s, which I described was so different that it was like going back to the court of Louis XIV compared to what's going on now. But a lot of younger, especially younger gay men, they look back on that period as this halcyon period of free sex, cheap apartments, easier living, not so much horrible to the, knife to the throat economic pressure which they're under now, and I feel very bad about. So they look back on that period as, certainly for them, escapism.
Lots of mustaches.
Lots of mustaches, yes. Everyone was Mark Spitzberg.
Does anyone else want to chime in on their contributions of thinking, well, what if I go back in time, memoir, and turn it, whether it's fiction or memoir, is that going to be the new thing? I'm seeing a lot of nostalgia, as Perry mentioned. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just finished a YA novel that takes place in the 80s, and there is so much nostalgia there. And also there was the liberation of being able to write about a period where there wasn't any social media and no cell phones.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm still doing that. I have a cutoff point with my fiction of before pre-internet. Well, internet, there's some internet, but cell phones, if you watch any television show now, half of the script is conducted by phone, which to me is just so lazy and so easy. So I'm going to go back in time to the 30s maybe next time, because I'm so tired of although I think Douglas Copeland did a fine work with the boom of the internet era, a novel that was all epistological through email, which at the time was so innovative. But I'm not looking forward to a novel that is all emojis and all text, even though I'm on it. So can everyone, let's go around one time. I think we have to wrap it up. It's almost an hour.
Yes.
Just talk about your next work that you're working on and what we can look forward to. Lucy.
Well, I already briefly, or not briefly, referenced my next work, which is a novel about a young woman who, I don't want to give too much away, but who's dealing with the white Christian right. And grappling with her trauma from being raised in that. So the novel's half of the novel takes place when she was a child in this church, and then the second half is the effects of that on her as an adult later in life. And the heart of the story is a friendship she started in that church with two young boys. So the three of them, it's their story.
Okay. And Perry, you have something coming up?
Well, yes. I want to put out another book of poetry. I haven't done a book of poetry in, maybe 20 years, and I miss that. I love writing poetry. And I am thinking in terms of a novel, which will be set in the past. And then there's also the work on the second volume of the memoir. So all of that is popping down there. The question is, at 73, can I pull any of this off?
Yeah.
But we will. I will. I will.
Rock it. So Farzana, you mentioned your upcoming work. Can you refresh us on that?
Yeah, I can tell you that the next book that's coming out is my first poetry collection. It's coming out fall 2022, and it's called You Still Look the Same. I had to think about that. You Still Look the Same. And that's probably about a decade's worth of fiddling around with my poetry.
Wow. Okay. Gar, upcoming projects?
So this story is based in the early 90s, and it's dealing with a teenager who's in this highly religious family in Oakland who went through a horrible trauma as a younger kid and is faced with a situation where he has to literally flee for his life. And yeah.
So it's a comedy.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to be flippant. I'm just playing Dick Cavett. I want to congratulate everyone, all of you authors on this panel and everyone who's going to watch this, on having endured and continuing to put out stuff during all this time. I have the benefit of having a job where I have to put out stuff every week. So that's been my part of putting out a book in the middle of the most contentious election, in the middle of a pandemic, the stupidest timing I've ever had for a novel, but I sold maybe 50 copies. So I'm proud of that. I really want to congratulate everyone on continuing to, and also Farzana, you notice I just lately started following you on Twitter, but also on Instagram. Farzana had a chat, an Instagram live chat with author tips, which this is wonderful what we're doing to counteract not being in bookstores, doing these online chats, embracing new media. And aside from not having, a novel with cell phones, I think Perry and everyone, we're really adapting. And this is what Lucy was talking about, evolving. We're evolving and adapting to getting our words out there no matter how we need to. Yes. And that's why we congratulate all of you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed this.
This is wonderful.
This is wonderful. Thank you for this great
Thanks
panel.
for organizing.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoy other Saints and Sinners 2021 events online. Some of our authors are also going to be doing individual readings where they'll be doing short excerpts. So look on the website for more stuff and follow all of us on the things. And thank you again, Tracy, and everyone smile. Thank you.